Good evening and welcome to the Saturday night of the first ever Classics Now Festival weekend. I very much hope you're enjoying the wonderful weekend, which is funded by the Arts Council of Ireland and brought to you by the Classics departments of University College Dublin, Maynooth University and Trinity College Dublin, together with the Classical Association of Ireland. Their work together has meant Classics Now has been able to spring into life as a brand new events platform running digital events and maybe soon live events, you never know, exploring how writers and artists today are turning their gaze to the arts, literature and ideas of ancient Greece and Rome as a way of looking anew at our current situations and difficulties. One of these writers is of course the classicist and writer Natalie Haynes, who sits next to me in a COVID-compliant studio in London, the city she calls home. Natalie Haynes is the author of 5 books. Her novel, 1,000 Ships, was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction 2020, one of the biggest prizes for fiction. Natalie's earlier books include The Children of Jocasta, The Amber Fury, and The Ancient Guide to Modern Life. She has also written and recorded 6, one of them in her cupboard during lockdown, series of Natalie Haynes Stands Up for the Classics for BBC Radio 4. I'm Helen Bagnall. I'm the founder of Salon London, through which I met Natalie 10 years ago on the publication of Ancient Guide to Modern Life, and I've been asking her many, many questions about classics ever since. And tonight I'll be talking to her about Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths, which was published last month. In it, Natalie Haynes turns her incredible gaze to focus on the women of Greek myth, beautifully tracking the way that they are portrayed throughout history, from their creation to right here, right now, and giving us cultural context for their many retellings in translations, theatre performances, artworks, film and television, music video, and even memes. There are 10 myths explored in her book, from Pandora to Penelope, Medea to Medusa, and we'll be talking about a couple of these women this evening. Hello, Natalie.
Hello there. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to Saturday night at Classics Now.
Oh, I'm missing being there in real. I miss you, Dublin. Sorry. I wish we could be there.
Oh, it's such a shame to not be there.
I know, I haven't been to Dublin for ages. Feeling really sorry for myself.
One day.
I know.
One day.
People of Dublin are probably grazing safely without me, though. They're probably delighted.
I know for a fact that Classics Night would much rather have you there.
I would rather be there.
Yeah.
Never mind. Next time.
Next time. Won't be long. So I spoke a bit at the beginning about the way Classics Now is exploring the classics this weekend. So I wanted to start by asking you why you thought so many artists and writers were now turning to the ancients to get ideas for our current situations and preoccupations.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I always feel a bit, I don't know what the word is, kind of arrogant answering on behalf of other writers. You know what I mean? You kind of go, I don't know why they're doing it. I don't know why I'm doing it. I do know why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because obviously classics has been a great preoccupation of mine for a really long time. And whenever I write, it's always informing the way I think and feel, I suppose. And so it's kind of hard to avoid. But there's definitely been a massive trend for retelling Greek myth in particular, but also for, representing ancient history, Greece, Rome, but more. We're perhaps starting to uncover bits of the ancient world that we should have spent more time looking at sooner. Because people like Joe Quinn's excellent book on the Phoenicians and things like that. It's like, oh, here are societies that classicists haven't spent enough time studying. So I think there's a general sort of sense that there's still a lot of ancient world out there to be explored. And at least from my perspective, the advantage of being now and the people that have gone before us having been who they were, the issue of women in the ancient world has been historically underexplored. And I vaguely feel like saying that when journalists ask me about, the current trend for retelling Greek myths with women at the centre. You go, well, I feel like it feels like quite a small corrective to quite a long-standing trend of telling Greek myths with men at the centre, if you'll forgive me for pointing it out. So, yes, it seems to me it's probably other people doing what I'm doing, which is to go, well, this story is awesome. And also, wait, has nobody told this side of it? Interesting. Maybe I should do that.
What a brilliant answer.
Thanks.
Thank you. And you made me feel so much better because I always get the sense through talking to you that classicists don't often get something new.
Oh, yeah, I think it probably depends on the classicist and the category of classicist. I feel like I discover something new every time I open a book practically or look at a piece of artwork, but then I can't work out whether it's because I'm, you know, in a constant state of discovery or whether I'm just really forgetful. It's one or the other.
So my first question, I wanted to ask a question about myth and really about its purpose of meaning. And I know you look at this a bit in your introduction to your book. In fact, you say that myths are mirrors of us.
Yes.
And that every generation finds their own version. So I guess I want to ask about the process of that happening. So how do these myths become mirrors of us?
Well, I suppose what happens is that we focus on the part of the story that feels most familiar and or most unfamiliar. It's like, well, which bit of the story am I interested in, the familiar bit? Which bit feels untold to me, the unfamiliar bit? And perhaps, you know, we're drawn more to one or the other end of that story, or perhaps end of that spectrum of story. And that's what makes us hone in on that particular side of the myth. For me, I'd been reading the Trojan War narrative since I was, God, there was absolutely no way through this sentence without sounding just really freaking old. I guess since I was 16, 17. So it had been part of my life when I embarked on 1,000 ships for, you know, more than 25 years. And yet at the same time, you know, I'd been reading plays by Euripides that focused on female characters. I'd been, you know, I think a chunk of the Iliad and the Odyssey were my GCSE and A-level set texts at school. And so I felt like I, in theory, had quite a balanced view of the war. I'd, you know, focused on the male characters in the Iliad, the female characters in Euripides. And so, you know, when it came to writing ships, it was like, oh no, this story can be told just from the women's perspectives. This war will look different if I can make it still epic, but focus it off the battlefield and onto everything around the battlefield, all those causes, all those consequences, all that integration of the two. So it was a familiar story to me, and yet I felt like I was still digging out people I didn't know. I didn't know, well, I must have read it as an undergraduate, I think, but I didn't know the story of Laodamia particularly until I came to write it in Ships. And she wasn't in the first draft of Ships, she was in the second draft. You know, I'd read her in Ovid, but I just didn't have her at the forefront of my mind when I thought about the Trojan War. And when I came to write Ships, oh no, wait a minute, this would be a really great focus for this chunk of the story. That would work really well. So it always, I think the act of writing any fiction, just as much as non-fiction, for me anyway, is a constant act of discovery. It's kind of trying to find what it is that drew you to the story and what it is that you feel the story has not had in it that you could bring to the forefront and take out of the shadows. I think that's a really important part of how we kind of negotiate our way through myth. I was thinking about this after seeing the Artemisia Gentileschi exhibition at the National Gallery in London last month, that they had this, you know, that it's a specific who's in the light and who's in the shadow, you know. So who we see, you know, in some instances Greek myth characters, in some instances Old Testament characters, but Bathsheba, for example, in the foreground of a painting, being spied on from far, far away. It's like, where is he? He's so far away. Our focus is on her, literally. You know, he's in the shadows, she's in the foreground, and it always feels to me like that's an option. And in a way, just that change of perspective means that you're discovering something different about it every time. At least that's the idea.
Mm. I know, I was just thinking about that when you discovered that day when you realised that you were going to rewrite the Trojan War.
Yeah.
That must have been quite a big thought.
It was a really big thought. Yeah, I was quite giddy with it, to be honest. I was walking home and I thought, oh, wait, can I do this? And all the way home I was thinking, I just need to get home so I can check that no one's done this already. You know, told the whole war like this, told the whole war from all these women. I just need to get, and I was thinking all the way back, I was like, there's Christa Wolf's Cassandra, I read that, it's really good, and there's Margaret Atwood's Penelope, yep. And I was like, but how many, but all of them. No, hang on. And yeah, I was sort of frantically Googling, thinking, and I just remember sitting there saying, is this mine? Can I have it? It was really quite, you know, like a child. Couldn't have been more excited.
Oh, and it does sound like almost like it's a research and sort of an intellectual exercise in going back and looking at all these myths and finding the one that you want to tell.
And then you have to kind of find a shape for it, which is the bit that you do with a novel, at least the bit that I do with a novel, which I don't feel the same way about with nonfiction, for me, is what shape is the book. And I feel very architectural about novels. I feel like they have a...
Architectural?
I do, yeah. I feel like they have a three-dimensional structure, or a sculptural one maybe. And it's like, well, what shape is this book, and how? And only when I've got that in my mind can I start writing. I just don't feel... Otherwise, I would just be sitting there kind of stabbing hopelessly at the keyboard. Like, the words aren't enough. I need the shape, the architecture of it before I can begin.
So let's start with Pandora. She's the title character of your book, and it's Saturday night at Classics now, so we don't have to ease into this.
No.
You have here an audience.
They were born ready.
Born ready. They know their Hesiod from their Homer.
I would certainly hope so.
So please tell me, how did we become wedded to this idea that Pandora should take all the blame and shame for letting all the ills escape into our world?
Well, the short answer is, in my view, two-pronged. One, she gets mistranslated by Erasmus, and two, we are desperate to blame a woman for the fall of man, because that narrative is in the Old Testament, so it underpins Christianity, which obviously has been an enormously powerful cultural force, quite aside from, religious beliefs. It's been a hugely important cultural force for 2,000 years, and what we might, in some terms, describe as the Western world, but I do see that's an extremely freighted term. So I use it with the least freight possible in the context. But what happens is that Pandora gets mapped onto the Eve story. So obviously in the Old Testament, the narrative is pretty, at a basic level, is pretty misogynistic. Everything gets worse because Eve does the thing she's told not to, which is eat from the tree of knowledge and share it with Adam. And therefore they're hurled out of Eden, out of paradise. And, the world becomes a worse place. And it's all basically down to the responsibility of the only woman at that point that there is, Eve. Pandora is not that. And certainly in ancient representations of her, you'd really struggle to find a version of her story which read like that. Even Hesiod, who's quite misogynistic and quite grumpy as a general rule, you wouldn't particularly be able to find that version of the story as clearly as that there. But the two stories map, and once you can see it, there's a painting by, is it Jean Cousin, I think, called Eva Prima Pandora. So the two have been specifically merged. The first woman is Eve or Pandora, depending on your belief system. But it is true, of course, that Pandora is the first woman according to the Greeks. In Hesiod's Theogony, we discover that she's made by Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, at the behest of Zeus. And it's as a consequence of Prometheus having stolen fire and given it to mortals. Previously, fire was just for the gods. And it's certainly possible to translate the Greek to suggest that it means, in return for, as a penalty for fire, Zeus sends Pandora, or, arranges for Pandora to be created and then is sent down to mortals to sort of pay us back. It's certainly possible to read it that way, although that still would suggest that she is the embodiment of Zeus's will rather than something intrinsically evil herself. The idea of Eve makes a choice, which is to eat the fruit from the forbidden tree. She is admittedly, guiled into doing that by a snake, which was also created by God, so it seems a little bit unreasonable to me that she takes all the responsibility. It's like, dude, you made the snake. But there we go. But Pandora doesn't do something bad. She, in Hesiodic terms, is something chaotic. She's Kalon Kakon. She's both good and bad. Kalon meaning fine, beautiful, good, and its opposite, Kakon, meaning shoddy, bad, ugly. But almost always the phrase is translated with the positive word as a visual thing and the negative word as a moral thing, beautiful, evil. But there's no reason why in the Greek that it has to be translated that way. She could just as well be an ugly good, although it's never translated that way because the context around it says that she's beautiful, she's created by all the gods, and they all ascribe different characteristics to her. But there's certainly no reason why she can't be, for example, beautiful, ugly. It's oxymoronic, but the phrase in Greek is oxymoronic, and that phrase exists in French, jolie laide, right? Pretty ugly at the same time. And yet we're kind of desperate for Pandora to be responsible for bad things. And so it's just too tempting. When Erasmus translates Hesiod, he takes the word pithos, which means jar, which she doesn't have, I should add, in the Theogony. In the short version, the first version probably, of Pandora's story that we have in Hesiod, there's no mention of a jar at all. And I should mention that in every artistic representation of Pandora from the ancient world, visual representation, she doesn't have any kind of receptacle at all. No jar, nothing at all. She's always shown in the act of being created, sculpted from clay. And then when Hesiod comes back to the story in Works and Days and gives us the longer version, then again we don't get any mention of Pandora acquiring a jar or wanting the jar. It's just when she arrives at the house of Epimetheus, brother of Prometheus, she has the jar. She's been ferried to this place by Hermes, the messenger god. So it seems pretty reasonable to assume that Hermes has supplied the jar. But he gets away, absolutely scot-free, as is always the way with Hermes. Nobody ever blames him for anything. So Pandora brings change when she arrives with mortals and the jar is opened, which in some versions she opens, in some versions Epimetheus opens it. In Aesop, of Fables fame, it's her husband who opens the jar. In some versions the jar is full of bad things, according to Hesiod. In Theognis, in his elegies, it's full of good things. So there is never a version of the story from the ancient world where Pandora malevolently opens a box and all the bad things in the world come out into it. That just doesn't exist. But when Erasmus translates Hesiod, he turns the word pithos, jar, into the word pixis, box. And within 20 or 30 years, you start seeing paintings of Pandora no longer with a jar or in the act of being created, as she was shown in the ancient world, but with a box that she's sort of getting ready to open. And then it becomes an issue of curiosity or malevolence to open a box. You've seen Greek jars. They're really narrow at the base. They're really chunky at the top. They're really easily knocked over. If you see them in a museum in Greece or Italy where there are lots of earthquakes, you'll see that they are wired to the wall because they're so... Don't put all the world's evils in there. That's an appalling idea. Don't do that. And so it is really interesting that there are all these variations of the story of Pandora, good things in the jar, bad things in the jar, opened by her, not opened by her, opened by her husband, etc. But the version that survives to us is Pretty Woman Does Evil Thing. And I think it's reasonable to suggest that there might be other factors in play apart from mistranslation. But I should say that Erasmus has form for completely changing the meanings of things by what look like really kind of minor translation errors. My favourite is not a gendered issue at all. It's the fact that when we talk about people who have an unusual bluntness to them, we might say, idiomatically, that this person likes to call a spade a spade. And that is from Erasmus, translating Greek again. But the Greek word that he translates as spade, scaphe, means canoe. So in fact, what we should be saying is he likes to call a canoe, and we don't because Erasmus made a mistake. And I think I'm going to say in most ways, I think the Pandora one, jar to box, is the more annoying. But I really regret the opportunities I've missed in my life to say, oh yeah, he likes to call a canoe. I miss it. I like the ooh sound. It makes me laugh.
I'm going to start saying it. It's a useful phrase. We can bring it back
We're going to push back against Erasmus.
I was going to ask you, was it a mistake or did he do it deliberately?
It's almost certainly a mistake. M.L. West, I think it was, a classical scholar, reckoned that he might have mistaken Pandora for Psyche. Psyche, out of Cupid and Psyche, does have a box. Pandora, jar or nothing. But jar, never a box. So did he mix up the two women? They've got quite similar names, but actually their names aren't as similar as the word for jar and the word for box, pithos and pixis. So I think it was probably just a translation error. But I think we have to assume that the reason that it caught on quite so vigorously is because it mapped onto that Eve narrative, this idea of a woman responsible for everything that's wrong with the world. The carefree age of men came to an end when Pandora arrives, according to Hesiod. But then I guess the question is, if Pandora is the first woman, and she is, you and I are descended from Pandora, men are descended from Erichthonius, according to the Greek way of looking at things. We're literally different races. It's probably fair in that case, according to Hesiod's way of looking at things, the carefree age of men comes to an end when Pandora arrives because women get involved and then things become more complicated. But it's also the case, remember, that she has been sent to us at the same point in exchange for or as a payment for fire. So that also makes life a bit more uncarefree. Before that we have this idea of what, a sort of a rustic idyll where people can't cook anything. It's like this is a huge evolutionary moment when fire is there's a reason why people focus on it. So does the world become more uncarefree at that point? Well, maybe, but it also becomes better, can we safely say? I think it's a good idea to think of Pandora as being in exchange for fire, because we can't think of fire as being an undiluted good or evil. Why would we? If you're incredibly cold and you want to cook food for the first time, then fire is really useful. If you live somewhere hot and your house is in the path of a forest fire, fire is really dangerous. And I think it's important to think of Pandora like that. She's not intrinsically evil any more than fire is intrinsically evil. She is an agent of change, the embodiment of Zeus's will. Wow.
And so Erasmus was writing down the myth of the mirror as he saw the world.
Right. So his version of Pandora's myth reflects a, profoundly, although he wasn't, I think he's quite a humanist thinker, sure. But he's living in a profoundly Christian culture with Christian art everywhere, all around him and things like that. And so you would think about Eve, even when, it is really difficult, I think, when you're writing these things. Sometimes you have to kind of unpick your own prejudice and kind of stop for a second. Oh no, wait. I'm assuming that these things, and sometimes you don't always notice that they're prejudices that are specific to you and your time. You just sort of believe that that's how the world is. It takes another way of looking at things. Like when you suddenly realise that your family does something one way and everybody else does something the other way, you're like, well, why does everyone do it wrong? Yeah. No, hang on a minute. What you grew up with isn't always the norm, is it? It's just what you grew up with.
It's a really good point. It's really important to remember that when considering it. And the other thing I want to say before we leave Pandora is there's a word for sculpted out of clay.
Is there a word for sculpted out of clay?
I thought there was a word.
I'm sure there is.
I thought it was in Pandora, the word for sculpted out of clay.
I can't remember. I wrote it months ago, last year. Actually, I wrote that chapter about a year and a half ago. So, yes, I'm sure there is, and I'm sure it's in there, but honestly, the chances of asking me to remember it on my third event of today is very slim.
Let me try another one.
Sorry to destroy the magic document.
Let me try another one, though, just in case. The one about being made out of blood. There are some incredible words that you've got in your book.
There are some words that I coined in that book. Yeah, no, I wanted to coin a word for the fact that snakes are made out of the blood of Medusa after she's been decapitated by Perseus. So yes, I did coin herpetohematogenesis, the act of spontaneous existence from the blood of a snake.
Yeah. There we go. If that isn't Saturday night, I don't know what isn't.
Nor do I. Other people are watching Doctor Who, I would imagine. Those fools.
Those fools, exactly. So we spent a bit of time with Pandora, and I wanted to because she's the title character of your book, and she's one of the women that, you restored to sort of beautiful mythological life so elegantly.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
Tried to.
You have. Oh, you have. It's an amazing book, Natalie. Sorry I haven't said that. It really is.
Thanks.
Let's talk about Penelope.
All right.
Okay. And the reason I want to talk to you about Penelope is
because she is great.
Because she's.
I love Penelope.
I know you do.
I do.
I know you do. And Pandora is the beginning of the book, and Penelope is at the end of the book.
Yes.
And also, I have heard that Daniel Mendelsohn was leading a discussion into.
I've never met him. I should stop saying this on the record because eventually it will start to seem like I'm about to go and stare at his windows or something. And I'm honestly not. I think he lives quite a long way away, but I'm not going to show any kind of expertise on this because that'll only make it worse. But his book, An Odyssey, is one of the best books I've ever read.
Oh, really?
Yes, it's absolutely beautiful. It's about him teaching. He is a classics professor, and he teaches a paper on the Odyssey to his undergraduate students, I think. Undergraduate students. And his dad, who was at the time really quite old, comes along to sort of find out more about what his son does and to be in the classes and find out about it. It's one of the most, I'm not even telling you the bits that make me cry, but it's just wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. I don't know why everyone isn't reading it all the time. It feels like one of those books where I thought when I read it, and I got it early, I reviewed it for somewhere, and obviously gave it an absolutely glowing review. And I thought, oh my God, everyone's going to be talking about this book. I thought everybody, it would be the only thing anyone. It's just, there's such a classicist mindset. You go, why is everyone discussing things that aren't? I don't understand. But anyway, it's glorious. I don't mind if you don't buy my book if you buy his book. That's how strongly I feel about it.
Why choose? Why choose?
Well, go to the library and borrow them both.
Yeah, could do. You know, it's going to be a long winter. There's time for
Yes,
both.
there is.
But Daniel is part of Classics Now, the weekend.
It's lucky we didn't go. Imagine it would be like last year when I met Emily Wilson and my opening words to her were, "I like you so much, I want your face on my T-shirt." And to be fair to her, she went, "Same." She was enormously polite in the circumstances.
Great response,
right?
Yeah, that's perfect.
I know, I've got to start acting cool again.
Well, he was in New York last night, obviously talking about the Odyssey, or Odysseus and his Odyssey, and that was the opening event for Classics.
That's a great choice.
I know, gorgeous, and it's still on their website, so if anyone wants to watch it, you can go and watch that. Yeah, exactly, you can watch it now.
I'm gonna.
But thinking about that opening event, it made me think about your perspective on Odysseus, Natalie, because you've looked at him through the eyes of Penelope twice.
I have.
Once as a final mythological woman in Pandora's jar, but also as a character in your previous book.
Friendships.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to get your perspective on Penelope.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of her voice and portrayal in Homer in the Odyssey, but it's an extremely interesting and difficult, in almost every way, portrayal of her character. Literally, when we first meet her in book 1, she's veiled, and that's not an accident. That's exactly how Homer wants her to be. I think to us the entire way through, we never really get a sense of who Penelope is and what Penelope wants, because over and over again we find ourselves saying, oh, at this point in the narrative, does she know that Odysseus is pretending to be somebody else in front of her? The beggar that she's talking to, does she know that's her husband? But he's been disguised by Athene. So, you know, is she not trying to see that it's him, or can she literally not? And at this moment when she talks about, you know, wanting to move their bed, which can't be moved, is she teasing him? Is she testing him? Is she checking that he's really her husband? Is this a kind of Martin Guerre moment? Is she angry with him? Which of these things is it? And I just don't think that's accidental. We have moments where she seems desperate for the suitors to get out of her house. And then there's a moment when she shows herself off to the suitors. But, for example, Athene puts that idea in her head. And, you know, Homer says so. He says, you know, Athene put into her head this idea. And it's like, well, so what does Penelope want? Not what does Athene want her to want? What's her response to it? What does she want? Don't know. And Homer's not going to tell you. You're going to have to, you know, make your own call and then see how you feel. But I think probably the first time you really get a sense of who Penelope is and what she wants is in Ovid. It's in the first of the Heroides, the letter from Penelope to Ulysses, the Latin name for Odysseus. And it's such a brilliant letter. I love that collection anyway. But it's remarkably, she's a human person, you know, she's got desires and needs of her own, and she's so kind of quick to say, you know, that there are moments which we might remember from the Odyssey where Odysseus is particularly heroic, where the Dolonaea, as it's known, I think in, is it book 10, I think, of the Odyssey, where he goes out on night exploits with his friend Diomedes, I think, and they go on an adventure and then come back, and it's incredibly, you know, daring and blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, when Ovid tells it from Penelope's perspective, she's like, oh, I suppose you were thinking about me and Telemachus at that point, were you? And we kind of, it's like, oh, yeah, no, he's not a hero to you. You know, the more heroic he is, the more cavalier he is about his own safety, the worse it feels for you, because, you know, you want him to want to come home to you. And we realise, reading that letter, she says at one point, you know, when you left, I was a young girl. If you came back right now, you'd find an old woman, because he's been gone for 20 years. Lifespan is shorter. And so it's at that point you think that her war has been harrowing in a completely different way from his. You know, he has 10 years of war and then 10 years of getting home, but 8 years of those 10 years, you know, we always think of it as a great adventure narrative, but 7 of those years are spent with Calypso and 1 with Circe. So it's only actually 2 years of adventuring. It's 8 years of horizontal adventuring. And, you know, for Penelope, it's just the whole thing has just been rumours or nothingness, and she's had to endure that on top of everything else. I think it's a really remarkable thing. You know, she says, for me, Troy still stands. And you're like, well, yeah, of course it freaking does. He hasn't come home. So for her, the war's still going on. It doesn't matter, you know, that the city's been burned and that it's, you know, men have been killed and it's women have been enslaved and all of those things. What difference does it make to her? Her freaking husband hasn't come home. And that urgency, that anger, I think it's just really startling when you come across it in Ovid. I think that's the first time I remember finding it, thinking about it. And then obviously when I came to write my version in Ships, my version of her is quite sort of snarky, but not too snarky. You know, they go together quite well. I hope. I'm quite fond of Odysseus on the quiet, even though he's obviously an absolutely hopeless hero. You know, the most dangerous place in Greek myth for a woman, anywhere near Theseus, for a man, anywhere near Odysseus. The only one of the Ithacans who gets home. Anyone? Just you. And I thought this sense of her being kind of witty and clever and, you know, a bit sarcastic and all of those things, it was something that, you know, she needed to be for me, because they should be a couple who you could make sense of. You wanted to think of them. I wanted to think of them as being, you know, they would have been a happily married couple if they'd spent more than 15 minutes together before he disappeared to the war. And I guess I really enjoyed writing her in those terms, but I wanted her to have that sort of core of sadness as time goes by, that she gets, in my version, she gets crosser and crosser. So she writes letters exactly stolen from Ovid, inspired by Ovid. So the first letter begins, you know, my darling husband, and then the next one's like my husband, and then it's like husband, and then it's like Odysseus, and then by the last one she's just, you know, kind of running out of patience altogether. And I sort of think, well, yeah, that's there for me anyway in the Ovid. And I think it's really interesting that Homer doesn't show that level of exasperation, but we can certainly find it there if we want to. We can find that version of Penelope in the text of the Odyssey. It's who you want her to be, I suppose. It's very enigmatic.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about that, talking about Penelope, because you can really see the difference between the non-fiction, researching what is there, and the fiction of, you know,
filling in the spaces that aren't. Yeah. Absolutely.
Nice work, Nat, on both.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's the nice thing about writing, the nice thing for me about writing Pandora after doing 3 quite intense novels, and particularly Ships, which was a very intense novel to write, is that I could do all the research and then look at it critically from the outside instead of having to imagine it traumatically from the inside, which is the slight downside. Penelope wasn't too bad, really, until the last bit where all the her slave women are killed, but up to that point she was quite good fun to write, but quite a lot of those women have a much more traumatic time than Penelope, so it got a bit harrowing.
Understated there with that last sentence.
There we go, yeah. That was some of my trademark litotes.
Okay. Yeah. I want to ask about the way that you use artwork in the book, because it's a big part of Pandora's style. It is. And because you illustrate the 10 myths in the story by, you know, talking us through brilliantly some exceptional depiction of the women in art.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just a broad question, say, looking back at your book now, which is now out in the world very much.
Fly free little book. I always feel like Marshall. Sail on.
Off it goes. It looks beautiful. But, you know, looking back on it, what do you think those different types of art has given your book? It's quite an unusual thing to do.
Yeah, I suppose I wanted to write about visual arts in this book and it really was the first time, you know, I'd pilfered artworks for my novels for a really long time. You know, Jocasta is full of things that I, you know, lifted from various museums and various other places and built into, you know, that world. And Ships is similarly, it's just crammed with them, with sculptures. The sculpture of Protesilaus completely informs the way that Laodamia speaks about him. The sculptures in the British Museum, the earrings that Thetis gets on her wedding day, also stolen from the British Museum. And so I was very keen to...
When you say stolen from the British Museum...
I did just, only imaginatively, not, I didn't actually lift them. Thomas Crown Affair-esque in my rucksack, I promise. A sort of rattling sound as I leave the museum. What? Nothing. Look over there, is that flamingo, etc. Yeah, no, I promise I didn't. But so I suppose I felt like I'd been inspired by lots of artworks, and yet I'd never had the confidence to write about them particularly, because I was I can't draw at all. I mean, I just can't. I just can't. And I kind of thought, well, it just felt a bit presumptuous to try and write about art, and yet at the same time, I really wanted to. And I thought, well, maybe if I try really hard, I'll get better at it as I go along. And actually, the book originally began with a description of an artwork of Rossetti's version of Pandora, and then there's an introduction now, so now it begins with something I'm better at, I feel like, which is describing film, and a reasonably schlocky film, Harryhausen's Clash of the Titans, one of my favourites at that. So yeah, I kind of felt like I knew how to talk about film and television, that I'm such a structure nerd that I was always really happy talking about those kinds of things. But talking about visual artworks was a real change for me in this, and music videos and things like that. So, well, maybe it'll all be all right. But, it was fun to do. It was fun. And I think if you don't try and do different things with each book, then you just end up writing the same book each time, even if it's technically a different book. It's like, well, I have to learn how to do something new. Otherwise, I'm not changing as an author, and that's important as well as writing the book, I guess.
Yeah, it's amazing. I didn't know that. And I didn't know that it was kind of new to you. It is brilliant. And I think I've said this to you before. I found... when reading it a second time, looking up all of the artworks.
Oh, they're so great, aren't they?
Yes, and it was just such a gorgeous
and
way.
And I missed out 50 times. It was just, I could have done just any one of the chapters could have just been visual arts.
Let's go on a virtual tour.
I know, so tempting. It's
amazing.
Yeah.
Were there any surprises? Were there any new loves? Were there anything?
Loads and loads. I'm really lucky that I've got a fantastic ancient art specialist friend called Ros, who lives in Melbourne, who did tons of checking and sourcing for me, like an absolute superhero. And there were, even as I wrote the manuscript, and then when I was editing it, was during lockdown, both here and in Melbourne. And I sent her the manuscript and said, can you kind of check my art for mistakes, which she very heroically and extremely efficiently did, which doesn't mean there aren't any. It just means that there would have been a lot more. And routinely she was sending me like, oh yeah, this is a really cool painting, this is a really cool vase painting, and I was like, why didn't I ask you a year ago when I could have included this? So yeah, it was super frustrating, because of course she knew loads more. I'd picked lots that she liked, but there were loads more I could have included. I think there's only one chapter that doesn't have any visual arts in, and that is the chapter on Phaedra, which just focuses on Euripides Hippolytus, and then the Ted Hughes translation of Racine's Phaedra. And the book was already long, and it was late. I shouldn't say that, and I'd missed the deadline. And there just wasn't time to kind of go back in and then insert a whole extra chunk. It was already 10,000 words over. So yeah, but that's my one regret is the art that I couldn't include, and it would have made it much too long a book. It could easily have been half as long again. And I don't think books are generally better for being longer. So I'm glad I had so little time that discipline was obliged to kind of exert itself. But yeah, I do have a few regrets for the artworks I couldn't include.
And so much happiness for the ones that you did.
So much. And it was lovely being able to say, okay, these ancient pieces, but also this, to my eyes, really modern piece, And so it was lovely being able to, track down paintings that I just hadn't seen, or have seen but hadn't seen for a really long time, and and to reappraise the way I'd looked at sculpture and things like that. Sculptures that I had walked past dozens of times and not particularly noticed or registered just how extraordinary they were, and to then find yourself going, oh no, hang on a minute, actually I've got that. Oh no, hang on, I actually have something to say about this. It was kind of fun.
Yeah, and it really makes your point about the different retellings of the story, because as you switch through time, as you switch through time and you're looking at amphora and then,
Absolutely.
film art.
Yeah, and Helen is the case in point, obviously your namesake, but every generation creates Helen as the most beautiful woman in the world for themselves. And so, it's like pre-Raphaelite Helen looks really sappy to me. Like, oh gosh, she just looks so feeble. And you're like, how is that the perfect ideal of female beauty relative to the incredibly smart, spiky one that we find in, Euripides' Trojan women? But of course, and then you get to the version of her that we meet in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and she's literally mute. Oh man, well, how is that an improvement? So yeah, it is really interesting seeing how Helen's changed through time. And in the Richard Burton movie of the Faustus Marlowe, then I'm pretty sure it's Elizabeth Taylor, is it? Maybe it's, but she's painted silver, I think, entirely, the full body paint. And you're like, okay, so that's more sort of cyber version of Helen. I don't know,
Yeah, and watching the films, and as you say, you really do move between popular culture and ancient artworks. It's all just adds to so many different retellings. Superb.
Thanks.
I'm not sure we're going to go to Helen. I think we're going to go to Clytemnestra.
Why not? Love Clytemnestra.
Yes.
Good choice.
Well, thank you very much. It's all down to you. So you say very clearly that Clytemnestra is usually presented as the archetypally bad wife.
She is.
Now, the reason I wanted to talk about her in particular was Helen, another Helen, who's a curator of the festival, said she was really hoping that there would be in the world that you would find a more sympathetic reading of her.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you, were you able to find this?
Yes, I don't think she is a bad wife. I think she's a really great mother. Bear with me. Because I admit she does murder her husband, and so it would be legitimate to say she's quite a bad wife.
Right.
I acknowledge that. And I'll also acknowledge that she is murdered by at least one and sometimes two of her children, and so that makes her seem like not the best mother in some ways. I'm going to let that go as well. But here's the thing. When she kills Agamemnon, at least according to the Aeschylus version that we get in the play Agamemnon, the first of the Oresteia trilogy, she is doing something remarkable, which is to take an extremely delayed vengeance for the murder of her daughter, of Iphigenia. And this is a collective trauma, the slaughter of Iphigenia. And we know that because as the play begins, it begins with the signal from a watchfire, which tells the watchman that Clytemnestra has left on the roof to pay attention to this. It tells him that Troy has fallen. So in other words, Agamemnon will be home shortly. He's been gone for 10 years. He's going to come back any second. And so the play begins with news. And you have to kind of do that with a Greek tragedy because the action has to take place in a single day and blah, 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 blah. So not always, but almost always. And so at that point, all that's happened is this signal has been received and understood. And then the chorus, who are old men, they were too old to go with Agamemnon to Troy 10 years ago. So they're older than fighting age a decade ago. So they're pretty old now. And they sing and dance, which is what choruses do in Greek tragedies. And their first routine is to sing about the human sacrifice of Iphigenia, who, I might add, they don't name. They tell this whole story, and it is raw with pain. And they talk about her being sacrificed like an animal. They talk about the fact that her father kills her. They talk about the fact that she's gagged in her final moments so she can't curse him, call down curses upon him. It is a brutal killing that they describe. And the fact that it's the first thing that happens in this play after the watchfire, Troy's fallen, and then this story spills out. It suggests that this is a totally unresolved trauma, not just for Clytemnestra, but for all of this city, which has seen its princess be killed by their king. It's a desperately upsetting retelling, and the fact that that's front and center, that Aeschylus wants us to know about it right at the beginning, and that this is where our attention, the chorus's attention, is focused. It means, I think, that we're supposed to see that none of the action in this trilogy can take place without recourse to the story of Iphigenia 10 years earlier. Because, of course, when the Greeks mass at Aulis to get ready to sail to Troy, they can't because there's no fair wind. And the reason there isn't is because Agamemnon, almost always Agamemnon, has offended the goddess Artemis, and a sacrifice has to be made to placate her. And the sacrifice, the priest Calchas, I think, tells him, is the slaughter of Iphigenia. And he persuades Clytemnestra to bring Iphigenia to Aulis from their home by saying that she's going to marry Achilles, so the kind of most glamorous, glorious Greek hero. And so it's impossible. I mean, you know, I wrote this scene in Ships. It's impossible to imagine that from her perspective without thinking that she would have been so excited and nervous and all of those things. You know, this is her big moment, and then she gets to what she assumes is going to be the moment where she's pledged to her extremely glamorous and famous and important husband, and she's murdered by her father. And I think it's perfectly reasonable as a response that Clytemnestra festers with rage for a decade. She does pretty much nothing but think about how she can pay him back. And she has an affair with his long-held enemy, a man named Aegisthus. And in some versions of this story, Aegisthus is the one who kills Agamemnon. And that's a much more domestic murder, you know, an adulterous affair and the boyfriend kills the husband. It's a much more manageable killing. You can see a version of that on, for example, the Documentaire painter's crater wine bowl, which is held in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And Aeschylus is going, Aegisthus rather, is going in for the kill, and Clytemnestra is just sort of holding an axe and encouraging him, which is how I always like to be encouraging. And yet when Aeschylus takes the story on, it's specifically Clytemnestra who does the killing. Aegisthus doesn't appear until right near the end of the play, a couple of hundred lines before the end of the play. She is the one who does the killing, and it's a really shocking scene. We hear Agamemnon crying out. We hear him cry out twice, although it takes 3 blows to kill him, so presumably after the second he couldn't speak. I might add that Cassandra, who's also killed, says nothing, so she obviously goes to her death much more bravely. But I think Aeschylus wants us to read this version of her, of Clytemnestra, as being like a fury, you know, and her children are presented in the same way. You know, they are furies who will avenge the murder of their father by killing their mother in the second play in Coiphoroi. And so, you know, this retributive justice lark doesn't work out well for the House of Atreus, that's just true. But I think there's something remarkable about the moment where Clytemnestra comes outside, having killed her husband, and the bodies of Agamemnon and Cassandra are at her feet or displayed behind her, depending on the staging. And the chorus of old men who have sung about Iphigenia at the start of the play are so appalled by what she's done. And she turns and says to them, you know, why do you care about his death in a way you didn't care about hers? And the thing is, I don't think there's a good answer to that. And also, they did care about her. We know, because we saw the start of the play, when that was all they could focus on. But they essentially thought, oh, that sad thing that happened, what a shame. And now this awful thing, how could you? And it's like, well, where was how could you when Iphigenia was murdered? And we also find out about Clytemnestra in Euripides and Iphigenia in Aulis, I think, that Iphigenia wasn't the first of Clytemnestra's children that Agamemnon killed. He's not her first husband. She was married to a man named Tantalus. She is nursing their baby when Agamemnon appears on the scene. He kills Tantalus and then rips the baby from her and smashes it on the ground. So then, by the time he kills Iphigenia, they've had to get married, he's had to make his wife pregnant, she's had to give birth, and then their daughter has to have made it to at least marriageable age by even mythic times. It's got to be like 15. So a good 16 or 17 years have passed between those two events. He kills 2 of her children 17 or so years apart. I mean, sorry, I really struggle to think that he doesn't at least in some ways deserve what he gets. I obviously approve of retributive violence in no way at all. I think clearly societal justice, the law courts, are a better bet for a good functioning society than retributive justice, where you kill the person who kills somebody you care about. But given that she exists before that time, it's really hard to argue against her, I think. Why wouldn't she? He's killed 2 of her children. She gave him a first chance. Why would she give him another?
Wow, what an answer.
There it is.
Well, no wonder we had to talk about Clytemnestra.
Well, we did.
And one of the other reasons I wanted to talk about it was there's another session on the Oresteia as part of this weekend.
Oh, so good.
On tomorrow with the play.
We could be in Dublin now.
Know.
This isn't the absolute worst thing about the pandemic, but it's certainly up there.
It's difficult, isn't it?
It is.
But
yes,
we could be there. I think there's an in conversation with the playwright Marina Carr tomorrow.
Excellent.
On the Sunday, and she's doing a 6-hour adaptation.
Yep.
For the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. So I think all the details are on the website. But yes, so it was stirring stuff. Hearing about it from you, Natalie, would be amazing to go and see it. And she'll be talking about that tomorrow. I'm not going to ask you about Medea, whether you were able to find a sympathetic reading of her, but of course...
Yeah, you'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, you'll have to wait and see. And I hear there may be a novel. You may be back in Dublin talking about...
I hope so. Medusa next, Medea after that.
That's right, yeah. Yes. But I do want to ask you about what it means to be a hero, because we're getting to kind of the end of our session. And, you always say to me, yes, you're a journalist, you're a broadcaster, you're a Women's Prize shortlist author.
I don't always say those things to you. I've never claimed any of those things.
But what you do say is you've always been a classicist.
That's true.
No matter what else. Yes, you've always been a classicist. But the years in the job, as a classicist, mean you've spent a lot of time deeply immersed in the myths in the way that previous generations have told them.
Yes.
And I just wondered if your experience of looking at these myths for your books, for Jocasta, for 1,000 Ships, and now Pandora's Jar, had fundamentally changed your idea of what it means to be a hero, or what heroism truly is.
Yeah, I'm not sure, actually, because I wrote my undergraduate dissertation 150 years ago on the female hero, and it was a comparative study of Euripides, Medea, and Hecate, so women who kill children. I know, now I know. But not particularly, because obviously I'm using the word hero there to mean both the protagonist of a play and also in the sense that Bernard Knox, the great classical scholar, described the Sophoclean hero, which was that it's a character who has a sort of normal human quality taken to an extreme degree. And so, for example, Oedipus, to go with the most famous Sophoclean hero, is quick-witted, but he's too quick-witted, and it shades into quick temper, right? So we want a clever leader. We know what it's like living in a time of stupid leaders, for heaven's sake. But he's too clever. It makes him paranoid, and that quickness of temper is ultimately, he would never, spoiler, he wouldn't have killed his father had he been a little bit less prone to rage at a place where three roads meet some years earlier. So these things do matter. And Medea and Hecate are both very much Euripidean heroes in that Sophoclean mould. I felt at the age of whatever I was, 21 or something when I wrote that, that they had this extreme emotional response, but that it starts out as a normal response. Medea is a good wife, she's a good mother, but it's distorted when jealousy overwhelms her. And Hecate is a good mother and grandmother, but the kind of piling of horror and loss on her, which happens in the Trojan women and in the Hecate, mean that she's stretched out of shape, and the revenge that both these women take is absolutely catastrophic. I would say the revenge that Hecate takes in her eponymous play is pretty much the most vicious in all of Greek tragedy, I think. More so than Medea even. It's a pretty good one. And so I guess I had long felt that being a hero was quite a nebulous concept. And I've had grave difficulties with the sort of simple heroic narrative of characters like Theseus. Oh, Theseus is a hero because he kills the Minotaur. Well, the Minotaur is a person, as you would know if you've read the Borges short story House of Asterion, in which the Minotaur is this incredible, tragic figure. And this short story is about 2.5 pages long or something. It made me cry the first time I read it. And so, how heroic is he? How heroic is it to abandon a sleeping woman on an island? Is that heroic? How heroic is it to forget to change the colour of your sail so your father throws himself to his death? Is that heroic? And so I had a lot of questions already about Theseus, and then I think probably while I was writing Ships, they really came up about Odysseus, who I do still love, But it's like, you're
Do
a
you?
terrible hero. You're an absolutely atrocious hero. Nobody gets back alive. It's absolutely. I do see that the mindset of the heroic creed in Homeric times is very individualistic, but there are limits. It doesn't mean you have to be the actual only one left alive. Oh, there it goes. But yes, no, I do still like him. Agamemnon, I almost literally can't bear. I practically come out in hives thinking about him. Menelaus, I think. I mean, I wish I could. The Menelaus of Euripides' play Helen, I really like, but in general, no. So yeah, I think as time's gone on, there's a moment where Oenone says in. Calliope maybe says it of Oenone in A Thousand Ships, where she talks about the responses of the two abandoned parties behind the affair of Paris and Helen. And she says, well, Menelaus starts a war, and Oenone, who's Paris's first wife, Menelaus, obviously Helen's first husband, Menelaus starts a war when he loses his wife. Oenone brings up their son single-handedly when she loses her husband. Which of those is the more heroic act? And obviously, if you're writing the Iliad, starting a war is the more heroic act. But I think if you're writing a novel in the 21st century, you might be bringing up a child on your own.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I wonder if we can just touch on Jocasta.
All right.
Before we finish.
Yes, let's.
Well, firstly, because there's two. She is a character close to your heart.
She is. Yeah.
And you wrote the novel Children of Jocasta, and also because there are two events coming up about Antigone as part of the festival.
Ooh, nice.
But you say that Jocasta can be hard to find.
She can. I mean, there are no certain visual representations of her at all
in
the ancient world.
No.
There's one contested image, but Edith Hall made an absolutely devastating argument for why it wasn't her, and I don't feel in any way able to refute it because I think she's right. So yeah, there is absolutely no certain image of Jocasta, and as I say, only this one contested image of her.
So what were you able to piece together?
Well, luckily there are literary sources, even though there aren't visual sources. So you get visual sources later. There are paintings of her, Renaissance onwards. But luckily we had not just the 120 lines she has in Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, but she has a fantastically good monologue at the start of the Euripides play Phoiniciae, Phoenician Women, which tells us a different story of what happens when the affair of Oedipus and Jocasta comes to light. Instead of, as happens in Oedipus Tyrannus, instead of her hanging herself, she doesn't do that. This is the kind of backstory to this play. She hasn't done that. It's Oedipus who has been locked up, imprisoned as a sort of, because his sons are so ashamed of him. Although he's not blind, I think. But Jocasta has sort of stayed on in this kind of, queen motherish, diplomatic kind of role. She's still quite important. And there's this absolutely extraordinary monologue at the start of the Phoiniciae where she basically backstories us up, because you have to do that because all the action takes place in a single day. She backstories us up, and she talks about, and also I suppose it gave the audience a necessary set of cues, because it's like, well, just so you know, this is obviously not the story of this family as told by Sophocles, because if it had been, she'd be dead by now, and this would be the underworld, and it's not, so here you are. And so she needs to give us her backstory, but she also needs to establish that it's maybe not the backstory that we're accustomed to. And in this speech, she talks about, I know I just fangirl about Euripides all the time, and I can't help it, because there are moments like this part of the Phoiniciae where she talks about having had her baby taken from her, Oedipus, as we now know, it's taken from her and given to a woman named Merope, the queen of Corinth. And she, Merope, and Polybus have been trying for a child but haven't been able to conceive. And the shepherds, I guess, who take Oedipus away from the Theban servant, slave who's been charged with exposing him on the mountainside on Mount Kithairon, they give the baby to Merope so she can pass him off as her own. And I think it's an incredible monologue for all kinds of reasons, not least because it gives us this sense of just how empty Merope's life must have been, that they were obviously having sex because otherwise there would be no reason to be disappointed or surprised that she wasn't pregnant. And yet there's obviously so much physical distance between them that she can pass off a baby as being hers. So they're not having very much sex, or if they are, it's not in a way which is very, literally illuminated, quite aside from metaphorically. And Jocasta, as imagined by Oedipus, says, "She nursed the child my labour pains produced." How extraordinary is it that a man wrote that, a man performed that, very probably to an audience of just men at the Dionysia? It's such a physical representation of it, that it's the physical pain of giving birth that Jocasta remembers, and then losing her child. But the physical response that Merope has to this child she hasn't given birth to is that she produces milk. I mean, how extraordinary is that? It's like, how wait, what now? And that Jocasta, that needs more, she needs more time spent with her. I don't think I've ever seen a production of the Phoenician Women staged. I can kind of see why, it's a strange play. But that version of her, why not? Why wouldn't we want to know more about her? And that's not an innovation by Euripides, by the way. He's trading on a story which dates back at least to Stesichorus, who's about 150 years earlier, I think. And there's a chunk of that. There's a chunk of what's called the Lille Stesichorus, a papyrus of Stesichorus, which was found in the Egyptology Institute, I think, in Lille. And the French had looted it, essentially. I know, we have to call these things out. We looted things from all over the ancient world, Egypt, no less than anywhere else, and brought them to the UK, and many of them went to America. But the French also had this mania for, arriving in Egypt and lifting things. And one of the things that got put in there, brand new at the time, Institute of Egyptology, was a mummy that was packed with cartonnage, so papyrus, to keep it safe in its container. And it was literally 70 years from the mummy being taken to Lille in France, and somebody going, "Is that Greek on those? Is that Greek on that?" And these were lines of Jocasta's from his version of what's basically that monologue. So she's been hiding in plain sight. It's a perfect illustration of how Jocasta's been treated. Is that there were words in her voice right in front of us, and they were too busy looking at the mummy to see the woman. It's like, excuse me, Dr. Freud.
I know, and we haven't talked about how funny the book is. It really is hilarious.
Good, I'm glad.
And but one of the things I absolutely loved is your point that when it comes to with Jocasta, when it becomes to depictions of women in art, when it comes to depictions of women in myth in art, the biggest transgression they can make is not murdering their husband and children.
No.
But being over 40.
It's being over 40, yeah. Don't do it. Don't do it, girls. If you want to be on a vase, I'm afraid what you need to be is a young woman of marriageable age. Ideally, approximately, 15 or 16, according to myth time. And perhaps a goddess, or very, very beautiful indeed. But yes, clearly not legally old enough by modern time standards. But the Greeks had slightly different ideas of what constituted childhood and adulthood from us. But you definitely didn't want to be over 40. No, not if you want to be on a vase. No, those are the rules.
It's really good fun. I think we're out of time, Natalie. You've been Natalie Haynes, author. You have, of Pandora's Jar. Absolutely superb book. Thank you so much for joining us, and me, Helen, in conversation with Natalie this evening. It just remains for me to say ClassicsNow has a whole other day of the Weekender to go to, so please go to the website classicsnow.ie, where you will be able to find all the info you need about other events across the weekend and in the future. And Classics Now is continuing till tomorrow night, Sunday, November the 15th. Thank you very much.